Welcome to the Climate Hour. I'm your host, Bob Grove. This last year has been a bellwether for climate issues. We've had a new federal administration changing the direction of US climate policy. The United Nations, IPCC, has published its first climate assessment report since 2014. And we've had the world gather in Glasgow for the United Nations Framework Convention on Climate Change, better known as COP26. We're joined today on Zoom by Winston Apple, author and former member of the Democratic National Committee. Hi, Winston.
Hello. Hi, Bob.
Julie Duckworth, climate justice activist and founder of LivZero. Hi, Jellie.
Hey, Bob.
Howie Hawkins, co-founder of the Green Party of the United States and presidential nominee in the 2020 presidential election. Hi, Howie.
Hi.
Stephen Melton, former instructor at the U.S. Army Command and General Staff College and leader of Kansas City's Citizens Climate Lobby. Hi, Stephen.
Thanks for asking me.
And Jim Turner, board member of the Thomas Hart Benton Group of Sierra Club and former chair of the Missouri State Sierra Club. Hi, Jim.
Hi, Bob. Glad to be with you folks.
So let's start with the United Nations AR6. That's the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change's sixth assessment report. The first part of this report was published last August and is titled The Physical Science Basis. It's the work of 234 scientists from 16 countries who've compiled around 14,000 different scientific papers into a final report that's been approved by 195 governments. That's a pretty comprehensive report. This report concludes that it's only possible to avoid warming of 1.5 to 2 degrees Celsius if massive and immediate cuts in greenhouse gas emissions are made. Media is describing this report as the UN's starkest warning yet of major, inevitable, and irreversible climate changes. This last assessment report, the AR5, was published in 2014. So here we are 7 years later. What does this latest physical assessment report tell us? Winston, do you want to start?
Not really, but I will. It just seems like these reports have been coming at fairly regular intervals, not this particular one, but various reports. The one in 2019 from Australia, New Zealand, they get, the predictions get worse and worse. And yet when you look at governments and what they're doing, the change is pretty small and pretty incremental. And of course, the last couple of years, we've seen enough increase in severe weather events that it's pretty hard to deny that this is happening. So we don't hear so much of that anymore. But I worry and wonder about when we will actually see meaningful action. I think that it's great. I'm maybe getting ahead of us a little bit here, but with the bill that may or may not pass, the one that just did, and the one that may or may not pass in its wake, we're doing a little bit more, but we're certainly not acting like this is the existential threat that it is.
Howie, the AR6, what does that tell you?
Well, I think the scientists are much more confident of their predictions. Their central conclusion was about climate sensitivity and the linear relationship between greenhouse gas emissions and the rise of global temperatures. So they put much more confidence in their predictions, and which means that where we're at right now, we're headed for a 3 to 4 degree rise in global temperatures, which is catastrophic. And as they point out, I forget whether it was part 2 or part 3. Part 1 has been published, part 2 and 3 have been leaked, but they still have to be approved by governments. So what the scientists say may get watered down when they finally released early next year. But the 3 degree rise in temperatures, which is about where the commitments of the world coming out of Glasgow is at, they say it's going to cause a massive drop in global food production, which means mass famine. So that was a conclusion in there that stuck out for me. It was interesting in the third part, they got much more political than the scientists have in the past, because I think they're just getting fed up that there's no action. So they said the inertia of using fossil fuels and emitting green gases is rooted in its economic system. They didn't say capitalism, but that's the dominant system. It's growth imperative and the political power structure it creates, where the people that profit from fossil fuels are the people that got the power. So it's interesting that they commented on that. I think one thing that stuck out to me was they said point blank, no new coal or gas plants can be built from now on. And the existing ones need to be eliminated within a decade if we're going to stay below the 1.5 degrees Celsius target. That is really moving a lot faster than the world plans to move at this point. Another thing they underscored is that the rich countries got to pay climate reparations to help the global south deal with the damages they already have and make the transition to clean energy systems. And this is not in the report, but I keep telling people, don't see climate reparations as, just paying off a debt or charity. It's an investment in the habitability of the planet for all of us. Because right now, almost two thirds now of greenhouse gas emissions are coming from the global south. It's really changed over the last 20 years, particularly the last 10 years. So take China, for example. It's like the workshop of the world, but 85% of what they produce is for their domestic market. And they created or built, about 50 coal plants last year. They project another 45 this year just to keep up with their energy needs. They're having energy shortages. And it's not just China. It's India, Vietnam, Indonesia, South Africa, particularly on the coal front. So that's a recommendation or an assessment from this International Panel on Climate Change report that is not being responded to by those countries, or really the United States. When we get to Biden's climate plans, I'll talk about that. And then I'll just stop here with a quote. And this is a quote from the Sixth Assessment Report. It says, life on Earth can recover from a drastic climate shift by evolving into new species and creating new ecosystems. Humans cannot. They're basically telling us if we don't get our act together, we're setting ourselves up for extinction. So this report is, much more strongly stated than in the past reports from this panel, International Panel on Climate Change.
So I think that informs us something right there, that the scientists in the UN have to be that much stronger in their statement, gone that far down the path. Stephen, you want to talk about the AR6?
Well, I agree with everything that's been said before. The highlight was we aren't moving fast enough. We need to go faster. This is serious and we can't delay it anymore. And calling by, a 50% reduction in CO2 emissions by 2030 is a huge call that was made in order to, that's what we're going to need to do to stay on the path to 1.5 degrees. I think the scientists have been consistent for a long time on this. Their modeling is getting better, and they do have a lot more confidence in their modeling, and we should have more confidence in their modeling as well. I think, in the United States, here in Kansas City, watching the smoke from the forest fires out west over Kansas City all summer long, this summer and last summer as well, and then seeing all the reservoirs that are draining out there, all the other climate effects that are just coming home to roost here in the United States is waking up a lot of people. And we have every year more and more people believing, all across the political spectrum, this is Republicans too, believing that climate change is an existential threat and the government needs to do more about it. And so, hopefully the shift in public opinion, the constancy of the scientific opinion, the shift in public opinion will eventually get the politicians in Washington and elsewhere around the country to do something meaningful about it.
Jellie, you're here as a young person, a person that's kind of dedicating your life to climate issues, and I think that's great. I mean, that you're the future of climate. And unlike some of us on this panel that's not going to be around to see a lot of these things, 2035, 2050, these predictions, you're going to get to live through those. What's the AR6 saying to you? I mean, where do you see this going, and what kind of a stark warning is that for your generation?
Yeah, I think usually people would be avert to putting their age out there, but I think it's very important to bring that into this conversation for sure. I think Howie put a lot of things into light and was very eloquent in the way that he described the dire aspects of this. And honestly, when I read this report, I grieved for a week. I'll be the first one to say that this report did make me cry, knowing that we've already created change that is going to last for a very, very long time. There's already stuff that we cannot, reverse. And I think one of the things from a community-based individual and in my workspace as an organizer, one of the things that stood out to me was their shared socioeconomic pathways, which essentially laid out the different ways in which we really need to shift our global culture in order to be more cooperative versus competitive. And that being laid out from a scientific base at a global level and kind of extracted down to how we're working with each other at nonprofit and city and state level, I think is really important to understand that this not only requires the scientific shift, right, that we really need to cut greenhouse emissions, no doubt, right, but also the cultural shift that needs to happen for us to even understand how interrelated our connection is with nature. And again, like how Howie said it, we are the only species that have not adapted over time. And so I think that there is a part of this that enlightened me how we navigate solutions going forward is also cultural. It's also the way that we choose to hold the tension between envisioning a better future, because that's the only option I have, right? Because I'm going to see that, but also recognizing where we are right now. So I think it's laid out both scientific and social aspects for me, how I am going to dedicate my work, in the future.
Joe?
Was that me?
That is you.
Oh, okay. Hearing aids. I certainly agree with the report and the implication that we are at an existential crisis. I tend to focus my attention on, yes, that's true. What can we do about it? I'm especially looking to the scientists for ongoing improvements on their model, the climate model. For example, how is the hydrologic cycle, the cycle of water where it goes up into the clouds, how is that affecting the cooling of the earth? Because we know we need to reduce fossil fuels so that we can reduce the greenhouse effect, but we also need to do what we can to improve the natural transmission of heat from the surface of the earth up into the clouds and then on out into space. So I need information about that from the scientists and continue to watch for it. Locally, I'm involved in an effort to improve soil enrichment, because here in the Midwest, that is what the farmers can do about this crisis. Sequester carbon in the soil. Kansas, I'm told that Kansas used to have 6% carbon content. Now it's down to 2%. So that's one indication of the problem. And as we enrich the soil, we can improve the ability to hold water and to cool with the transpiration of that water. So as I agree very much with what Jellie is saying about improving the culture, and we can't be dependent on the corporations and the powers in Washington to improve the culture. We've got to do that ourselves with our own efforts. And it can start with stopping raking the leaves and treating them as rubbish to be carted off. Let's mulch the leaves so that more of the nutrients that is in the leaves soaks into our lawns. And that can be a step. It's a way to start having our culture say, look, we've got to use natural processes instead of just relying on chemical fertilizers and biocides, which are causing many, many problems. And I can certainly talk on and on about that at some other opportunity. Thanks.
Oh, thank you. You know, Howie kind of touched on the reparations thing a little bit in the IPAR6, and that seems to be a key issue with a lot of people. I mean, just the economic impacts. But as Howie was saying, I mean, we shouldn't look at that as paying for something. We have to look at that as protecting ourselves. You know, the not so much reparations as we just need to protect ourselves, and we need to, those countries that have the resources need to be able to step up to the plate and see this happen. Jellie, I was curious about you, if you could talk about that in terms of the social justice you were referring to.
Yeah, thank you for that. While I do think that it's important that we reframe reparations from a perspective of self-preservation and protecting, I do think it's also important to acknowledge that part of reparation is really understanding the historical and systemic inequities that have been performed globally, specifically on countries in the global South. And so part of saying that, which is the uncomfortability, I think, of people, is having to admit and take that responsibility while also recognizing, but this is now an issue that affects all of us, even though it affects some of us disproportionately, right? And so when we look at reparations, I think it's a both and situation in which you have to acknowledge, right? We may not be able to address every historical or systemic or colonial issue at this particular moment in time, because the umbrella, the overarching issue is climate change at this moment. But the pathway for social justice is recognizing that is a further vision that we hope to attain, right, in this process. And so what can we do in the meantime as far as reparations and financial ones? That's something I would like to break down later as we get more into like the US, and then with COP26. But that is a huge thing that's not been, I think, highlighted over time, how much the financial resource is extremely important. But that's uncomfortable, again, because we're tying that to a social responsibility that we've had for, a very, very long time. I think if we could look at it from a perspective of this is an issue that affects all of us, and we can recognize that, even though we have to prioritize what we are, finding a solution for right now, but understand that that is still a goal. The recognition of the colonial impacts is still a goal in the future. So we can't lose that vision or acknowledgement when we say that, but we do need to recognize that right now, this is about adaptation, this is about protection, and know that that is still a goal of ours.
So let's jump to actual applications. Let's talk about the Biden administration's progress on climate. They've rejoined the Paris Climate Accord. They've reversed permits for Keystone pipelines, stopped new drilling on federal lands and water. They've passed the Infrastructure Investment and Jobs Act, which includes measures to reduce greenhouse gas emissions in the power and transportation sectors. So how do you think they're going? How do you think they're doing? And Jellie, just continue with you.
Awesome. I'm going to start with positive things, because I think that is a good place to start here. And most of the things I'm going to touch on is regarding his leadership, which I think has been very important within his administration as a whole, all the way from, nominating Dave Holland to New York's Gina McCarthy and Ali Zaidi. I think, if I'm saying those right, maybe butchering the pronunciation there, but the fact that they have been taking really big steps within their own degrees as an Indigenous leader, and also as leaders, helping with more leadership within New York, for example, with Gina and Ali. I think those are some really positive outcomes that have been from changings of leadership. The Climate Leadership Community Protection Act in New York has been one of the biggest commitments in history towards increasing the leadership in environmental justice. And so I will say that has been probably the biggest highlight for me as far as his administration. But I would like to pass it off and hear more about positives, and maybe we can get back into the critiques here in a second. So.
Okay, Winston?
I'm the wrong guy to go to if you want positives.
That's okay.
I'll try to throw some positives in here. I served on the Democratic National Committee from June of 2016 until August of 2020. I tried very hard to simply get the Democratic Party to live up to our credo, our platform, which is all wonderful. And I felt like in trying to get the Democratic Party to be more small d democratic, paying more attention to grassroots and public opinion, I think we're seeing right now that, I would say I'm very pleasantly surprised at not just President Biden, but Speaker Pelosi and Majority Leader Schumer. If you'd have told me, even in August of 2020, as I was exiting the Democratic National Committee, that all three of the major leaders of the party would be moving as dramatically and emphatically as they are, I would have not believed it. There's been a sea weather change. Now, most of my work for the past 7 years, and especially the last 3 years, and even more so the last year, I've been writing a book about how our political system and electoral system are broken and dysfunctional. And we're seeing that right now. When you have a single senator from West Virginia up to his eyeballs in the cold business, able to block and diminish what's going on, that's a dysfunctional system. And when you have a public, I served on I was a member of a climate panel back in, I believe it was 2016, 5 years ago. And in our concluding remarks, I said that I was hoping that we reached a point in the United States as soon as possible where a majority of the voters would make climate the #1 issue in deciding who to vote for, and would no longer vote for people who were not doing what we needed to do to respond appropriately to global warming. Well, polls indicate that we've passed that point several years ago. It may not be the top issue for most voters, but roughly 2/3 of the voters recognize that this is a serious threat, maybe a smaller percentage that recognizes the existential nature of the threat. And yet we've got a system that allows 1 or 2 senators to block this. Now, to be even-handed here, if there were 1 or 2 Republican senators, even 1 or 2, who would join the Democrats in passing more substantial climate legislation, Joe Manchin would be canceled out. And we need to cancel out his vote. So as much as I'm dismayed by the fact that a handful of Democrats are still serving their corporate benefactors rather than the common interest of humanity is distressing, I don't want us to lose sight of the fact that there is not a single Republican senator who has stepped up to make up the vote we need to get this done. Is that
Jim?
possible?
Jim, how do you think the Biden administration is doing on climate?
I agree with Winston that I think President Biden's leadership has been very good. If his Build Back Better program had been passed as it was originally designed, we would be much better off. So we just look for the Congress to do better, and we need to work to elect a better Congress. I would also note that Biden, his administration is pretty active about trying to use executive orders and cancellation of some Trump era rules to make immediate changes without having to have the cooperation of Congress. And it's good to see that those efforts are being made. However, we need to realize that that can cause, that can involve needing to use a lot of care, because procedural rules have to be very carefully complied with, especially after the Trump administration, which kind of played fast and loose with procedural rules. And that has raised precedents now that could be used to question what the Biden agencies would do with enacting rules. Also, there can be problems about who has standing to sue and matters like that. By the way, I need to insert here that any opinions I'm expressing here are my own opinions, and I am not speaking as a representative of the Sierra Club.
Indeed. You're listening to the Climate Hour. I'm your host, Bob Grove. We're speaking with Winston Apple, Jellie Duckworth, Howie Hawkins, Stephen Melton, and Jim Turner about climate policy. Stephen, how do you think the Biden administration is doing on climate?
Well, I think they're doing a lot better than the previous administration. Okay, and trying to turn the ship around 180 degrees is especially with the Congress, basically the same Congress, slightly different, is quite a challenge. I think Biden set the right goal, which is a 50% reduction by 2030. And he's looking at ways to make that happen. I think the first thing that they wanted to do was the Clean Electricity Performance Plan, which would basically get the fossil fuels out of electricity by 2030, substantially, completely by 2035. But you know, as Winston said, there was a senator from West Virginia who said, well, why are you picking on the electricity industry? Because the electricity industry is the only sector of the American economy which has reduced its CO2 output over the last 20 years. So now Biden is switching tack. I don't know, you know, through the reconciliation program, and is now his administration and 49 Democratic senators and Nancy Pelosi has said she'll deliver the House, are now looking at carbon pricing as a way to get to that 50% reduction in CO2. Again, it comes down to Joe Manchin. And Joe Manchin of West Virginia has a big decision to make. Does he want to be known as the guy who helped solve the climate crisis, or does he want to be known as the guy who goes down in history as the guy who doomed the planet to not meet its goals? I've heard from Senator Whitehouse, Sheldon Whitehouse of Rhode Island, that Manchin knows that climate warming is an existential crisis that has to be met. I kind of look at it, you know, if you've ever bought a car, you know, you go in there and, you know, at some point the dealer says, you know, how much, what do I have to do to get you to drop out in this car? And I think that that's where we are with Manchin. I think that's where Whitehouse is. Senator Whitehouse, I think that's where the president is. I think that's where the Pelosi is. They're just adding on more benefits for those 14,000 coal miners in West Virginia to see what it takes to get, you know, Manchin's vote on the reconciliation bill. And, you know, from what I hear, it's a 50-50 proposition right now. They don't know which way he's going to go, but the negotiations are very active back there now. So, you know, as we're taping this, we're on the verge of either a great victory or a great defeat in our goal to get emissions down by 50% by 2030.
So Howie, let's give you a last word on the Biden administration's climate policies.
Well, we're in a climate emergency and Biden's not acting like it's an emergency. I mean, to compare him to Trump is to compare him to, you know, just flat on the ground. I mean, it's such a low bar, it isn't a bar. I think we got to stop taking defeats and calling them victories. Yeah, he appointed some people that look good, but then, you know, Deb Haaland is headed on Interior, but the Biden administration has approved 2,400 drilling permits since taking office. They have had the opportunity to stop 20 pipelines and 3 LNG export facilities, liquid nitrified gas, and they have not. Just line 3, which there's been a big fight in northern Minnesota over, is carrying dirty Alberta tar sands oil that over its lifetime will be the equivalent of running 45 coal plants during that time. Biden could have stopped that like he did Keystone, but he had to stop that one. He had to stop Dakota Access. He had to stop Enbridge's Line 5 across Michigan, and you go on and on. So I look at actions, not words. And then when we get to the legislation, I mean, this bipartisan infrastructure bill is a pro-fossil fuels bill. It adds $25 billion in new subsidies for fossil fuels on top of the $20 billion that we're giving. So they're going to subsidize carbon capture, hydrogen fuel made with natural gas, so-called low emissions buses running on natural gas or gas-derived hydrogen, and petrochemical and plastics manufacturing. And plastics is like a big new profit center for the fossil fuel industry. So, the progressives in Congress made a deal. Okay, we'll vote for this bill, which we don't really like. If the moderates, the so-called moderates, the rest of the caucus will vote for the Build Back Better reconciliation plan. And, I don't even think the original American Jobs Plan that Biden put forward was adequate in any respect. I can't go into it now. I wrote 10,000 words about it in an article called Biden's Climate Pledge is a promise he cannot keep. Because after he released the American Jobs Plan, a few weeks later it said, we're going to cut emissions by 50 to 52%. I'm wondering, where did 52 come from? I haven't been able to find any study. It's just like he pulled it out of the air. And what was proposed and what he had before, like the clean energy standard that was just mentioned and is now gone, even with that, it wouldn't have come close to cutting in 50%. And I went through all the sectors and just showed the investment level and what they proposed to build just wasn't getting close. And of course, they dropped that, which means there's no sticks in this plan. No, it's all carrots. It's all corporate welfare. Before, with the clean energy performance standard, as they called it, a utility that reduced fossil fuel emissions by 4% in a year would get rewarded. They get money. That's gone. That was the stick. In order to qualify, and you had to do that to qualify for the benefits, which are still there. But I'm afraid what we're going to have is what we've had over the last decade, where, yeah, they build out more renewables, but it doesn't reduce fossil fuels. We have had carbon emissions reduced because they've replaced coal plants with natural gas plants. But the impact on the climate may be worse with natural gas, at least according to these professors up here at Cornell University, because they talk about all the methane leaks from the gas fields, the pipelines, the compressor stations, right to the point where the gas is burned. And then the clean energy performance, what qualifies as clean energy that will get these, grants and subsidies and guaranteed loans and whatnot, includes nuclear, carbon capture of burning fossil fuels, waste incineration, biomass burning. These are not, when climate activists talk about clean energy, they're talking about wind, solar, efficiency, wave and tidal, and appropriate hydro, not these other things that actually burn and release carbon dioxide and other greenhouse gases. So we may end up like we have in the last decade, adding renewables, but not reducing fossil fuels. And then finally, without going into all the details, I'll just mention one thing. A lot is made of the Climate Conservation Corps, and give the Sunrise Movement credit. Biden's original plan had 10 billion for that. Now there's 30 billion because they were the squeaky wheel and made themselves heard with demonstrations and marches and hunger strikes. The problem is this is not like the climate, what was it called? The Civilian Conservation Corps during the New Deal, which was a government agency that directly set up the projects and hired the people to do them. This is going to be run through AmeriCorps, which is, the old neoliberal model. So AmeriCorps will get this money, they'll put out requests for proposals, nonprofits will make grant proposals, and you'll have this whole bureaucracy with a lot of white collar people making money before you actually deploy to the projects. And if you know anything about Vista, you know that a lot of these projects are boondoggles. It's just a roundabout way of doing it where a whole lot of middle people are going to get a lot of the money. And that is true of a lot of those programs. And I could go on and on. Just one more point. They basically assume for transportation, we're going to swap out electric engines for internal combustion engines without trying to reduce the amount of traffic and get it off the roads onto the rails, which then gets up, because there are other constraints, like how much, where are you going to get all this lithium and cobalt and the waste stream that creates. So, man, there's a lot to say. And then one last word. There's nothing in either of these pieces of legislation about climate reparations. Biden has made some statements, but the fact is the original Green Investment Fund set up by the UN a decade ago, they were supposed to have 100 billion a year in that fund. And they're down like around just over 10 billion after a decade. And then most of what they've used that for is loans, not grants, which puts the global South further in debt. And, you know, the US contribution, I mean, we could pay for the whole thing. It'd be 10% of the military budget, and we could be making friends instead of enemies. So I could go on, but I'll stop there.
Okay. Let's jump over and talk about COP26 in Glasgow. This is the 26th Conference of Parties to the United Nations Framework Convention on Climate Change. So for those of you who are keeping track, this was also the third meeting of the parties of the Paris Agreement and the 16th meeting of the parties to the Kyoto Protocol. So it's a fairly important meeting. And for the first time, fossil fuels have been specifically included in the resulting Glasgow Climate Pact. But that initial language was watered down in the final document. For instance, India led a switch from in coal language. Instead of phasing out coal, we're now referring to phasing down coal. Many scientists interviewed by the Associated Press now say that we can forget about 1.5 degrees Celsius and start worrying about exceeding 2 degrees. You know, that's 3.6 degrees Fahrenheit for those of us who don't live in the metric world. Princeton University's climate scientist Michael Oppenheim has said the 1.5 Celsius goal was already on life support before Glasgow, and now it's about time to declare it dead. So is the Glasgow Climate Pact enough? I mean, where are we at on that? What are your thoughts? Howie, you want to start with that one?
Yeah, it's not enough. It's not enforceable. I would say, just to be say something positive for a change, you know, the business as usual scenario before these commitments were made was to head toward 5 or 6 degrees Celsius global warming, which is, you know, totally catastrophic. It's a climate collapse. And now the commitments made, they call them nationally determined contributions, if they're actually implemented, one of these carbon tracking outfits says, well, it would get us at a 2.7 degrees Celsius rise. Now, as I pointed out before, the AR6 says, you know, at 3 degrees, we got, you know, massive food shortages and mass famine. So we haven't avoided catastrophe, but basically what's projected now is maybe half of where it was before this process started. So I think you can say the discussion has moved, the countries feel some pressure, but on the other hand, it's little progress, and we got a long way to go and little time to get there. So, you know, this is more a talk shop than, you know, they can't enforce their stuff. I think what we as people concerned about the climate got to do is focus on our own governments and get them to move like this is the emergency that it is.
Stephen, what about the Glasgow Climate Pact?
Yeah, well, clearly not enough. You know, we aren't going to get a dictatorship of the left, a global dictatorship of the left that's going to give us everything that we want in terms of climate. It's just not going to happen. We're much more likely to get dictatorships of the right from populism. So, you know, we should quit our dictatorial demands. What we got to do, if we're going to solve this with democracy, we need to build political will across the political spectrum to getting things done. And we're going to have to use a lot of the power centers that currently exist. Now, Citizens Climate Lobby says, you know, which I represent, says we need to use the financial system in order to incentivize the move away from fossil fuels, and not just with a carrot, which is one of the big problems that we had with the Clean Energy Performance Plan, that costs so much, but also with a stick. We need to start taxing carbon so that industries and consumers move away from carbon and start to look at non-carbon alternatives. And we believe that if we do that, we can do a lot to get us to meet our 2030 objectives and our 2050 objectives in terms of carbon emissions. And that's why the scientists at the Intergovernmental Panel for Climate Change say in their reports that carbon pricing is necessary if we're going to solve this. So that's where we stand. We need carbon pricing. I think that that's the only way to enforce international commitments is to have carbon pricing and to punish exporting countries like China, and India wants to be an exporting country, that are not going to clean energy fast enough. That's what's going to happen. I know that one of the positive outcomes of Glasgow was that a lot of big investors, governmental investors and financial investors and from the private sector are getting the message that now is the time to quit investing in coal and petroleum and start to shift those investments to alternative energies. And I think the businesses who have to make investments in their businesses, that in these investments, capital goods will last for 10, 20, 30 years, are getting the idea that when you make these new investments, don't make them using fossil fuel technologies, but next generation technologies that are non-polluting. I think the message is getting there. What we need to do is start shifting the financial focus of the world away from continual investing in fossil fuels towards investing in the technologies that can deliver us from the tyranny of fossil fuels. So some progress, but obviously more needed.
Jim.
I regret to sound a pessimistic note, but I am reading reports that their concern about the availability of fuels for the coming winter could be something that causes panic among the populace, and so that's just one more part of the challenge that we face. By the way, my battery's low. I may drop off any time here unless I can find a power source. But to speak further to Stephen's point, there are also calls for the Federal Reserve. Biden needs to appoint a.
And I think we just lost Jim. So let's jump over to Winston. Let's talk about the Glasgow.
Dave Barry, quote that I enjoyed a long time ago, maybe relevant here, but maybe not. He said, if you had to sum up in one word the reason the human race has made so little progress after all these years, that word would be meetings. And I'll add to that a quote from Benjamin Franklin that well done is better than well said. With those caveats, I would say that it is important for the governments of the world to be communicating on this, because this isn't a problem that can be solved on less than a global scale. And Julie mentioned reparations earlier. We talked a little bit about that. That's a trigger word for a lot of conservatives, corporatists, whatever. But she went on to add that we need to focus on the fact that this is a global problem and it will require a global solution. I can't remember, I think it was Howie might have said that we need to look at our own government and maybe, I think the thing that has struck me for years about this is if you look at what's required to respond appropriately to the climate crisis, jobs are created in the process. whether that's manufacturing and installing solar panels or wind turbines, getting truly zero emission mass transit systems put in place. The list goes on and on and on. The thing in common with most of the proactive solutions is that they put people to work. Franklin Roosevelt proposed a federal job guarantee in his 1944 State of the Union address. We're now more than 3/4 of a century down the road from that. He called on Congress in 1944 to enact the necessary legislation. And what I'm been researching and writing about is the fact that whether the issue of concern to you is the climate or jobs or affordable access to healthcare for everyone, background checks for gun control, whatever your issue is, in a political system that is dominated and controlled by corporate interest, we're not going to get any of this done until we change and address what's wrong with our political system. If we were a genuine democracy, if the will of the people determined public policies, we would be much further down the road in solving this problem already. And there are two simple but nearly impossible, at least the second one is nearly impossible, reforms that would make us a true democracy. The first one I've come up with is a system of proxies for citizens and weighted votes for legislators that would meet John Adams' vision and James Madison's vision of a Congress that would vote the way the people would vote if this were put to the people directly in a nationwide referendum. The problem is that can be done in the US House with legislation. To extend it to the Senate would take a constitutional amendment. So would making it clear that corporations are not people, et cetera, et cetera. So the second reform we need is to amend Article 5 so that the Constitution, our Constitution, can be amended by a simple majority of we the people. And until we get things like that put in place and can elect a government that actually represents people instead of states and corporations, we're going to continue to fight a losing battle, in my opinion.
Jellie, what does the Glasgow Climate Pact mean to you? Do you think, where does it lead? Do you think it's enough?
Yeah, let me do my best to kind of incorporate everything we've talked about so far up until this point, because I think it's important. I didn't get to finish my last thoughts about the Biden administration, because overall I agree with this group here. I don't think it's enough, very similar to my thoughts about COP26 and the Glasgow Pact. I don't think that it's enough. However, I'm in a position where I have to choose to hone in on what is positive. That's my position and what I have to move with and to critique those and refine those. One of the main things I want to bring out in this plan that comes back to this talk about reparations, come back to this talk about changing political leadership, which is one of the reasons I do want to acknowledge the Biden plan for, because the narrative and who's leading that matters, specifically in the regards to who is going to continue to be in charge moving forward. But one of the major upsets about the Glasgow Pact was the fact that we are not giving poor countries enough to get them out of situations that rich countries have essentially put them in, right? And that is something that ultimately trickles down all the way down to local governments as well, is that we are not giving enough for people to refine these systems. We're actually contributing to it if we don't understand how much that financial impact really matters. And so there's a quote from a reporter of GRIST who says international cooperation to cut emissions hinges on rich countries recognizing and rectifying that injustice. And I really think that's something we need to acknowledge both at a global scale and at a local scale. And so from my perspective, I also agree with Howie that it does come down to local government. That is the biggest impact that I think that we can make. And as myself, working as a climate justice worker for the city of Kansas City right now, and making sure that I am incorporating that leadership. And incorporating people's visions and community strategies into plans from the ground up and not from these top-down methods is important. Not only do we need to change the systems, but in the process within those systems that comes with it as well. So how are we getting input from communities who are actually frontline and having these problems exacerbated because of the conditions that we put them in? That matters. And so overall, in regards to understanding those who are going to be disproportionately impacted by climate change, we're not doing enough, in my opinion. However, I do think that we can only say that we're moving steps forward, but with policies, again, at the local level, and then if we look at that, globally, the rate of where we are right now is going to be nothing less than warming 1.8 degrees, and so we're not nearly close to our goal, but at least we can cut it down to that as far as I think Howie said, the business as usual. So that's what we have to hone in on first and keep refining it. And hopefully my optimism comes in of my only stance is to keep cutting that as we keep targeting the cracks in these plans. But I think a lot of movement comes from community leadership from the ground up, but I'm biased too, so.
Well, thank you for joining us today. Jellie, where can listeners go to learn more about your work?
Sure. You can visit my consulting business in climate equity at LivZero.com. That's LIV, no E, ZERO.com.
Thank you. Stephen, where can people go to learn more about you and Citizens Climate Lobby?
The best place to go is the Citizens Climate Lobby website. It's just citizensclimatelobby.org, citizensclimatelobby.org, no punctuation except for the dot. And you can learn all about the organization and or the legislation that we support and how to join if you wish to join.
Howie, where do you want to send people to learn about your work?
My campaign website from 2020, howiehawkins.us. And we have a lot of information on the climate issue. We got an actual budget for an eco-socialist Green New Deal, much more detailed than anything else I can find out there, even the Build Back Better plan. There's a lot of information there. So it's howiehawkins.us.
Winston, where do you want to send people?
There is a website, winstonapple.net, that has a lot of my collected works, including a lot of music, but the better site for what I've talked about today is governmentbythepeople.org.
Thank you. Jim, where would you like to send people to learn more about your work? You're muted, Jim.
For work about using fallen autumn leaves to enrich the soil, you can go to tracygarden.org. That's TRACYGARDEN.org.
Well, thank you. And thank you to our listeners. We welcome your questions and comments at climategkc.org. That's climategkc.org. This is the Climate Hour. I'm your host, Bob Grove.